Hello, welcome to the France 24 interview. I'm Annette Young. Once again, the oldest profession in the world has made headlines here in France. The French Parliament recently voted to make it illegal to pay for sex. Now, under the new law, anybody caught purchasing an act from a sex worker will be fined €1,500 for the first offence. They'll also be required to attend classes on the harms of prostitution. But not everybody is convinced that this approach will actually work. One such person is Dr Sarah Kingston, a criminologist from Lancaster University who specialises in prostitution law, and she joins me today. Thanks so much for being with us. Now, on the surface, many would think that these new laws in France are in fact protecting prostitutes by placing the criminal onus on the client. But you say it will have the complete opposite effect. Why?
That's right. Criminalisation and the research which surrounds the sex industry has demonstrated that criminalisation often pushes the industry underground. Clients fearful of being prosecuted, and also sex workers who are also fearful of being prosecuted, try to avoid the police by displacing spatially, so they might displace to unknown locations. So often they displace to areas such as industrial estates, moving away from residential areas, which puts them in greater danger potentially because they don't know those locations. And people's research such as Hilary Connell has demonstrated that this potentially increases the risks. Sex workers sometimes also take less opportunity to assess whether a client might or might not be dangerous to them. They also sometimes displace temporarily, so for a specific period of time, sex workers will sometimes displace at different periods of the day, or they might displace to other types of crime. But importantly, I think the danger here is, for criminalisation, sex workers are placed at greater risk because they go into unfamiliar locations. And I must say, listening to the news about France recently and the decision that has been made, I was quite disappointed to hear that the French Senate had ignored some of the discussions that they had back in 2014, in which they consulted sex workers and clients who had acknowledged and recognised that potentially it would push the industry underground and make sex workers more vulnerable. And even the French police themselves has identified that this may potentially increase the dangers. They also recognise, the French police, that this may hinder their ability to identify victims of sex trafficking because clients may be fearful of being prosecuted and therefore don't report instances of force or coercion that they may witness in their purchase of sexual services. They might not report that to the police. So there's some real dangers here with criminalisation that's been acknowledged in research. And similarly, there's been cases, in particular here in the UK, there was a very well-known case that Hilary Connell had identified, in which a sex worker had attempted to avoid the police, had moved away from the city that they were working, and subsequently were murdered because they were working in an unfamiliar location. So I think there should be caution taken in this approach.
But this new law brings France into line with Sweden, which has had the same legislation in place since 1999, and some there are claiming that it's helped to sort of cut prostitution by half in the country.
That's nonsense. If you speak to sex workers who work in the industry, they will tell you categorically that what's happened in Sweden is that it's been pushed underground, that there hasn't been a reduction that's been suggested. And certainly the evaluations that's been done in Sweden, and people like Jay Levy, who's actually done some work in Sweden, has identified that there's been a lack of support by NGOs, people who work in local and central government. There's been a lack of support for the Swedish model, the Swedish approach. So I think, you know, looking at Sweden as an approach to follow should be taken with caution, because what's been projected in the media and by the Swedish government isn't always necessarily true. And certainly indications suggest that the industry hasn't reduced to the extent that's been suggested.
But let's talk through some of the clauses in this legislation here in France. Firstly, it will treat the sex worker as a victim rather than a criminal. Isn't that a good thing?
Of course. I mean, moving away from stigmatising sex workers as criminals is an important move, and I think that's the right approach to take. Whether they should all be identified as victims, again, I think should be taken with caution. Some sex workers that I work with, I volunteer for an NGO in the UK that works with street-based sex workers. Would they identify themselves as victims? Not always. And also, I've also worked with male, female and trans workers who would identify themselves as people who actively, consciously choose to sell sexual services. So I think, identifying all sex workers as victims is denying their agency and ability to make decisions that affect their own lives.
And the other clause, which is gaining a lot of traction here, is that it will make it easier for foreign sex workers, many of whom are illegally here in France, to acquire a temporary residence permit if they embark on a program to find other work. And we know that up to 80% of 40,000 estimated sex workers here in France are indeed foreigners. Again, is that not a positive benefit?
Well, I think there was claims in the media recently about the number of migrant workers, and again, I think that should be looked at with great caution. There's been suggestions here in the UK that we would have thousands of migrant and trafficked victims here in the UK working in the industry, and again, that doesn't reflect the diversity of the sex industry. Often, what happens is that research and evidence identifies large cities such as Paris and thinks that applies to the rest of France, for example, and that doesn't. So, the number of migrant workers, again, I think we should be looking at this in a very cautious way and not assuming that is the exact figure here.
The reality is, though, isn't it, Dr Kingston, that you're never going to eradicate prostitution. Which country, if any, has got it right?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, but I can tell you a couple of things. Some previous research of mine which has looked at residential and business communities and people who live in those areas, the people that I've spoken to, the general public, would say that they would support regulation. So they would support the licensing of brothels, of parlours, of zoning, so having managed zones. The majority of people that I spoke to, the general public, were actually in support of regulation rather than criminalisation. They themselves recognise that the industry has been going on for many, many decades, many hundreds of years, and this is something that we can't eradicate. People choose to buy this, people choose to sell this, whether we agree with that or not. And so the best way to deal with this is to regulate it. And a lot of people that I'd spoke to were supportive of a regulatory model because they could tax the industry and therefore contribute to the public purse. In terms of sex workers, there is a greater support for decriminalisation because it moves away the regulation that, for example, we see in Germany, where they feel that they're being stigmatised and labelled as sex workers. Because in a regulatory environment, sex workers obviously have to undergo medical checks if that's part of their regulatory environment, and also register as sex workers. So sex workers would prefer decriminalisation. So it really depends on who you're speaking to. And I think that there are benefits and limitations to all the different models.
And then, of course, there's human trafficking, which certainly benefits from the lack of legal consistency when it comes to the massive differences in laws and approaches in various countries. Surely you need a global approach, but is that at all possible?
I agree. We need to deal with trafficking in a very holistic way and look at this internationally rather than just looking at a country-by-country basis. We know that trafficking occurs internally, so it's not just from one country to another, although that does occur. So we need to look at internal trafficking and how that is being facilitated and undertaken, and how vulnerable men, women and young children are being identified and coerced into this type of industry. And similarly, when we look at international trafficking, so from one country to another, we need to deal with in an international way. But this is very, very different to somebody who is saying and telling you that they are actively choosing, consciously making a decision to sell sex. And I think it's a dangerous game to confuse trafficking with the sex industry. because the two are very, very separate. Obviously, trafficking takes place in the context of the sex industry, but we need to deal with traffickers. We need to deal with the reasons why people might choose to migrate to sell sex, or might migrate for different reasons and then become trafficked in their migration. So I think that we need to target that, the trafficking routes, traffickers, rather than dealing with demand. Because dealing with demand is really just trying to deal with the after effect of that trafficking process. By the very time that they come to France or come to the UK, traffic victims have undergone abuse, coercion, and have a very difficult process. So I think that we need to deal with this much, much sooner rather than just dealing with demand.
Now, coming back to prostitution, is the nature of the industry changing? For instance, has the rise of feminism having any effect on the industry as such?
Yeah, I mean, the industry has changed substantially. I've been conducting research on this for many, many years, and certainly with the rise of the internet, that's changed the industry somewhat. There's more, the sex industry certainly has moved online, and so we've certainly seen the rise of camming girls, online sex working. And we also have seen the rise of a more diverse sex industry. So we see male workers, trans workers. We've also seen in recent years female clients, which is completely neglected from all of these debates. When we talk about the ban on clients in France, what politicians mean is a ban on male demand. There is no recognition at all of female clients in any of these debates, and I'm currently conducting research in the UK on women who buy and pay for sexual services, and I can tell you that women do also buy sex.
And is that on the rise?
It's difficult to say, really. It's not been really documented. We've seen literature and research on female sex tourism, and that's been identified for many decades. So it's very difficult to identify because of the hidden nature of the sex industry. But on top of that, women are even more hidden because they're kind of just out there.
I'm afraid we've run out of time there, Dr Kingston. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And that's it for this edition of the France 24 interview. Do stay with us for more news and headlines which are coming up very shortly.